The detonation cord lies coiled in the mud like a dead snake, its waterproof casing torn from the hard landing. Jake McNiece crouches beside it in the pre-dawn darkness of Normandy, his hands working methodically to splice the frayed ends while German voices echo from the farmhouse 200 yards away. June rain has turned the Norman hedgerows into a maze of slick clay and tangled roots. Nothing like the neat aerial photographs they'd studied back in England. The TNT satchel beside him weighs heavy with moisture and doubt. Half the primers scattered somewhere in these ancient fields when his chute caught the apple trees. Above him, the stone railway bridge stretches across the narrow valley like a sleeping giant. Intelligence had called it a minor span, but McNiece can see the truth in the moonlight filtering through the clouds. This bridge is old Roman stonework reinforced with German steel, built to carry the weight of centuries. The briefing had made it sound simple: drop in, set charges, blow the span before enemy armor could cross. But nothing about tonight has gone according to the neat plans drawn up in rear echelon comfort. McNiece's squad had been scattered across 3 miles of Norman countryside, their Pathfinder beacons either destroyed in the drop or marking positions that bore no resemblance to the maps. Of the 12 filthy 13 paratroopers who jumped with him, only 4 made it to the rally point. Hayes nursing a twisted ankle from a hard landing in a drainage ditch, Kowalski missing half his gear after cutting free from a hedgerow that nearly strangled him, and young Brennan still shaking from his first combat drop into occupied France. The demolition mission that seemed straightforward in the briefing tent now feels like threading a needle in the dark with broken tools. German armor is already moving up from Carentan, and this crossing represents the fastest route to Utah Beach. If the panzers reach the coast, they could roll up the entire beachhead before the follow-up divisions establish their footing in Norman soil. McNiece understands the stakes with painful clarity, but understanding doesn't repair waterlogged charges or stretch detonation cord that's 30 feet shorter than the span requires. "Sarge, we got movement," Hayes whispers from his position behind the stone wall. 3 Krauts coming down from the farmhouse. Looks like a patrol checking the approach roads. McNiece doesn't look up from his work. The cord splice needs to hold under pressure, and he's only got one chance to get it right before dawn breaks over the Cottonton Peninsula. His fingers, steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, twist the copper conductors together with the precision that made him the best demolition NCO in the 506th PIR. Around him, the others wait in the pre-dawn gloom, their faces pale and exhausted from 6 hours of movement through enemy territory. The German patrol passes within 50 yards of their position, flashlight beams sweeping the ground where McNiece's parachute silk still hangs from the apple branches like a surrender flag. He holds his breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. These men followed him here because they trusted his reputation for pulling off impossible jobs with whatever materials came to hand. But reputation doesn't detonate charges when your equipment looks like it went through a grain thresher. 20 minutes later, McNiece makes his decision. The waterlogged charges won't generate enough force to drop the bridge using standard demolition doctrine, but the stone piers show centuries of weathering along the mortar joints. Instead of trying to blast through the main supports like the manual prescribes, he'll target the weak points where Norman winters have already done half the work. It means getting under the bridge, placing charges by feel in total darkness, and hoping his improvised firing system doesn't fail when armor starts rolling across that span. The plan forms in his mind with the clarity that comes from years of working with explosives in situations the textbooks never anticipated. Every bridge has its secrets, structural flaws hidden beneath layers of stone and steel. His job is finding those secrets before the panzers find his squad. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. "You're out of your goddamn mind," Hayes mutters when McNiece explains the plan. "That's a 70-foot drop to the creek, and if those charges don't fire, you'll be sitting under there when the panzers roll across that bridge." McNiece grins, the expression invisible in the darkness, but audible in his voice. "Hell, Hayes, when have you ever known me to do things the easy way? The manual says use the main supports, but the manual was written by some engineer who never had to work with wet charges and short cord in the middle of occupied Normandy. The descent into the ravine takes 20 minutes of careful climbing, down rain-slicked stone, McNiece's gear bag slung across his back, while his boots search for purchase on rocks, worn smooth by centuries of Norman weather. Below him, the creek runs black and silent, swollen from 3 days of June rain that turned the invasion beaches into a muddy hell. Above, the bridge's underside reveals itself as a maze of stone arches and iron reinforcement bars, more complex than the reconnaissance photographs had suggested. Working by touch alone, McNiece positions the first charges against the mortar joints, his hands guided by 15 years of experience that started with Oklahoma oil fields and evolved through Army demolition schools into something approaching art. Each placement has to be perfect. Too high, and the blast will disperse harmlessly into the night air. Too low, and the structural damage won't propagate through the ancient stonework. The detonation cord snakes through the darkness like a lifeline, connecting each charge in a sequence that will bring down the entire eastern span, if his calculations prove correct. German voices echo from above as he works. A convoy has arrived at the farmhouse, trucks, motorcycle scouts, and the distinctive rumble of tracked vehicles that makes every paratrooper's blood run cold. Through gaps in the stonework, McNiece catches glimpses of headlights sweeping the Norman countryside and hears the harsh consonants of field commanders coordinating their advance toward the beaches. The panzer column is ahead of schedule, which means his window for demolition is closing faster than anticipated. Back at the company command post 3 miles away, Captain Morrison studies the situation map with growing concern. The night drop had scattered his paratroopers across 20 square miles of Norman bocage, and radio communication remains spotty at best. Half his demolition teams missed their drop zones entirely, leaving critical bridges and road junctions unguarded as German armor probes northward from their assembly areas around Carentan. "Any word from McNiece's squad?" Morrison asks his radio operator, a kid from Wisconsin whose hands shake slightly as he adjusts the dials. "Nothing since the drop, sir. Last we heard they were moving toward the railway crossing, but that was 4 hours ago. Morrison knows McNiece's reputation for improvisation and insubordination in equal measure. The Filthy 13's unofficial leader had a talent for accomplishing missions while completely ignoring the methods prescribed by higher headquarters. But talent wouldn't matter if German armor reached the coast before the beachhead could consolidate, and Morrison finds himself hoping that McNiece's stubborn streak proves stronger than his disregard for proper procedure. The final charge placement takes McNiece to the bridge's center pier, where the water runs deepest and the stone shows stress cracks from decades of heavy traffic between Norman villages. McNiece wedges the last TNT block into position, his hands cramped from cold and his shoulders aching from the awkward positions required to reach the structural weak points. The splice in his detonation cord holds, but barely. He can feel the connection loosening with each movement as he threads the wire through gaps in the ancient stonework. Above him, engines rev to life with a sound like mechanical thunder rolling across the Norman countryside. The German column is moving again, and the first vehicles will reach the bridge within minutes of dawn, breaking over the hedgerows. McNiece begins his climb back to the firing position, moving faster now, knowing that hesitation means capture or death in a Norman ravine that will become his grave instead of his victory. Hayes and the others wait at the detonator, their faces tense as vehicle headlights begin to illuminate the bridge approach through the pre-dawn mist. McNiece reaches the firing position with seconds to spare, his breathing ragged from the climb up rain-slicked stone that offers little purchase for muddy boots. Through the Norman gloom, he can see the lead vehicle, a Panzer IV with infantry riding on its deck plates, their weapons ready for the kind of close-quarters fighting that turns hedgerows into graveyards. The tank commander's head and shoulders protrude from the turret hatch, scanning the countryside for signs of American paratroopers. McNiece can see the man's face in the dim light, young and alert, probably no older than Brennan. Behind the lead tank, more vehicles stretch into the darkness. Half-tracks loaded with infantry, supply trucks, and the self-propelled guns that could turn Utah Beach into a killing ground if they reach the coast before the beachhead consolidates. "Now, Sarge!" Kowalski hisses through clenched teeth. They're on the bridge. McNiece's hand hovers over the plunger, calculating weight and timing with the precision that made him legendary among demolition men throughout the 101st Airborne. Too early, and he'll only damage the span, leaving it passable for determined engineers. Too late, and the Germans will be across in force, spreading out into the Norman countryside where scattered paratroopers can't stop them from reaching the invasion beaches. The lead tank reaches the center of the bridge, its steel tracks grinding against ancient stone that has carried traffic for generations. McNiece counts heartbeats, watching the column bunch up as more vehicles crowd onto the narrow span. The German commander waves his arm, urging the following vehicles forward across what he assumes is a secure crossing. In that gesture, McNiece sees the same urgency that drives every soldier in Normandy tonight. The race between German reinforcement and American consolidation that will determine whether the invasion succeeds or dies on the beaches. 3 miles away, Captain Morrison receives fragmentary reports from other units scattered across the Norman bocage. The news is mixed, some bridges blown successfully, others still in German hands, and too many demolition teams simply missing in the maze of hedgerows that compartmentalizes the Cottontown Peninsula into 1,000 small battlefields. The radios crackle with urgent requests for information, status updates, and ammunition resupply that won't come until the beachhead expands inland. "Sir," Morrison's operations sergeant says quietly, "we've got reports of armor moving north on 3 separate routes. If they're coordinating a counterattack against the beaches, our scattered people won't be able to stop much of it." Morrison studies the map, mentally calculating distances and march times. Everything depends on men like McNiece, demolition specialists working alone in enemy territory with improvised equipment and orders that assumed perfect conditions. The invasion's success hangs on 1,000 small decisions made by NCOs who never see the big picture, only the bridge or road junction in front of them. Back at the firing position, McNiece feels the weight of more than just the plunger under his hand. Every choice carries consequences that ripple outward through the Norman countryside, affecting men he'll never meet and battles he'll never see. The young tank commander across the span probably has a wife back in Germany, maybe children who draw pictures of their father in uniform. But war reduces complex human beings to simple equations. Enemy armor that must be stopped, bridges that must fall, missions that must succeed regardless of the cost. The explosion, when it comes, seems to tear the Norman night apart. The eastern pier disintegrates in a cascade of stone and mortar that has stood since Roman engineers first spanned this creek. The bridge deck tilts sideways with a grinding roar that drowns out everything else, and the lead panzer disappears into the ravine, followed by 2 half-tracks and a company of infantry whose war ends in twisted metal and Norman stone. In the sudden silence that follows, McNiece stares at the destruction with emotions he can't quite name. The bridge is down, the German column scattered, and Utah Beach will have another day to consolidate. But somewhere in that wreckage are men who will never see home again, victims of a war none of them started but all of them must finish. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The secondary explosion comes 20 seconds later as ammunition in the half-tracks detonates, sending debris cascading across the Norman countryside in a rain of steel and stone. McNiece's ears ring from the concussion, but through the ringing he can hear something else, the screams of wounded men trapped in the wreckage below. The sound cuts through him like shrapnel, lodging somewhere deep in his chest where it will remain for decades after the war ends. Hayes claps him on the shoulder, grinning despite the chaos spreading across the valley. "Guess they were wrong about you being undisciplined, Sarge. That was textbook perfect, even if you threw out the actual textbook." But McNiece barely hears the praise. His attention fixes on the western span, which still stands intact despite the destruction of its eastern counterpart. German engineers could have it repaired within hours if they bring up bridging equipment, and there are other routes through the Norman bocage that lead to the same objective. One bridge down means a delay, not a victory, and delays only matter if someone uses the time wisely. "Kowalski, get on the radio and try to raise battalion," McNiece orders, coiling the unused detonation cord with automatic precision. "Tell them the railway bridge is down, but they need to get people moving on the secondary routes before the Krauts figure out alternate crossings." As the first light of dawn breaks over Normandy, revealing the full scope of the night's destruction, McNiece allows himself a moment to consider what they've accomplished. The mission briefing had called for a simple demolition, but simplicity rarely survives contact with Norman reality. Instead of following doctrine, he'd improvised a solution that worked with the materials and conditions actually available, not the ones prescribed by manuals written in peacetime comfort. The cost calculation is more complex than the after-action reports will ever capture. One German armored column delayed, maybe 24 hours bought for the Utah Beach consolidation, but also 30-odd men dead in a ravine who were following orders just like McNiece and his squad. War demands these trades, but it doesn't make them easier to carry in your memory when the shooting stops and you're left alone with what you've done. Young Brennan approaches hesitantly, his face pale in the growing daylight. "Sarge, what do we do about that?" He gestures toward the ravine, where smoke still rises from the wreckage, carrying the smell of cordite and worse things that McNiece tries not to identify. "We move out, Brennan. Our job was the bridge, and the bridge is down. Everything else is somebody else's responsibility now." But even as he says it, McNiece knows that responsibility doesn't work that way. The young tank commander's face, visible for just a moment before the explosion, will follow him through decades of Norman nightmares. Success in war always comes with a price tag that isn't calculated until years later, when you're alone with your thoughts and the sound of distant thunder makes you remember the grinding roar of ancient stone giving way. 3 miles away, Captain Morrison receives McNiece's radio report with relief mixed with apprehension. The bridge is down, but losing it means his scattered paratroopers are now cut off from potential reinforcement if German counterattacks develop from the south. McNiece's success has bought time for the beachhead, but it's also isolated his own men in enemy territory with limited ammunition and no clear extraction plan. "Sir," the radio operator reports, "we're getting fragmentary contacts all along the perimeter. Looks like the Germans are probing for weak spots, maybe setting up for a coordinated push toward the beaches." Morrison studies his situation map, mentally calculating the positions of his scattered squads against the probable routes of German reinforcement. Men like McNiece can delay armor and disrupt communications, but they can't stop a determined counterattack by themselves. Everything depends on how quickly the beachhead can expand inland and link up with the airborne forces scattered across the Norman countryside. As McNiece's squad prepares to move out from their firing position, each man carries a different piece of the night's events. Hayes remembers the precision of the demolition, the way McNiece calculated timing and placement with absolute confidence. Kowalski thinks about the secondary explosion and wonders what kind of ammunition creates that particular shade of orange flame. Brennan tries not to think about anything at all, focusing instead on checking his gear and following orders that keep him moving forward through the Norman morning. McNiece shoulders his pack and takes one last look at the destroyed bridge, fixing the image in his memory alongside all the other structures he's blown during the war. Each demolition tells a story about desperate improvisation and calculated risks, about men doing impossible jobs with inadequate equipment because someone has to, and they happened to be there when the orders came down. The secret that McNiece never tells anyone, not even in the debriefing sessions or the bar conversations that follow veterans through decades of trying to forget, is that the Eastern Pier almost didn't fall. His improvised charges, waterlogged and underpowered, barely generated enough force to crack the Roman stonework that had withstood centuries of Norman weather. For 30 seconds after the explosion, the bridge stood intact, except for a cloud of dust and debris that made it look more damaged than it was. Only the secondary charges he'd placed as insurance, hidden in the mortar joints where stress cracks already weakened the structure, provided the additional force needed to bring down the span. But those charges had been positioned during a moment of pure panic, when he realized his primary demolition might fail, leaving him crouched in a Norman ravine with German armor rolling overhead and nothing to show for the mission except dead batteries in his detonator. The moment when the pier finally collapsed, taking the entire eastern span with it, came as much from luck as from skill. A flaw in the Roman construction that no modern engineer could have predicted, a weakness that only revealed itself when explosives stressed the structure beyond its centuries-old tolerance. McNiece had gambled everything on his ability to read stone and steel by touch in total darkness, and for 30 terrifying seconds it looked like he'd guessed wrong. But the official report won't mention those 30 seconds of doubt, or the way McNiece's hands shook as he watched German armor cross what should have been empty space. Instead, it will describe a successful demolition executed according to plan, reducing the night's chaos to a few clean sentences that miss everything important about fear, improvisation, and the razor-thin margin between success and catastrophe that defines combat operations in occupied Normandy. Hayes never sees McNiece's face during those crucial 30 seconds, doesn't notice the way his sergeant's breathing stops as they wait for stone to fall that should already be lying in the creek bed below. The explosion's aftermath comes so quickly that by the time anyone can assess the damage, the bridge is already collapsing in a cascade of debris that looks like textbook demolition work. Only McNiece knows how close they came to watching German armor roll safely across an intact span, while his squad crouched helplessly behind a stone wall with empty weapons and no escape route. The tank commander who dies in the collapse never realizes that his death comes from luck as much as from American explosives. He spends his final moments trying to reverse his vehicle off a bridge that appears undamaged, unaware that Roman stonework is shifting beneath his tracks as centuries-old mortar joints finally surrender to forces they were never designed to withstand. His war ends not from superior American planning, but from a construction flaw that predates the United States by 1,000 years. Years later, when McNiece reads accounts of the Normandy invasion in history books and magazine articles, he'll search for some mention of that terrible 30-second delay, some acknowledgement that victory often depends more on luck than on skill. But the historians prefer clean narratives about American ingenuity and superior training, stories that don't include demolition specialists gambling on stone fractures they can't see while enemy armor rumbles overhead. The weight of that secret, the knowledge that his reputation for miraculous improvisation includes at least one miracle he didn't actually perform, becomes part of the invisible cargo that veterans carry home from war. Not the dramatic burden of obvious trauma, but the quieter weight of understanding how thin the line really is between heroism and disaster, between the stories people tell and the memories that wake you up at night decades later. Captain Morrison's after-action report will describe McNiece's demolition as executed with exceptional skill under difficult conditions, language that transforms Norman chaos into military efficiency. The report won't mention waterlogged charges or improvised firing systems, won't acknowledge that success sometimes depends on factors beyond human control. Such admissions would undermine the carefully constructed narrative that American victory came from superior preparation and training, rather than from desperate improvisation and occasional luck. But McNiece knows the truth, and the truth follows him home to Oklahoma, where the sound of freight trains crossing railroad bridges brings it all back. The 30 seconds when ancient stone refused to fall, the moment when he realized that all his skill and experience might not be enough, and the pure chance that finally brought down a Norman bridge and bought 24 hours for men he'd never meet fighting on beaches he'd never see. 50 years later, McNiece sits in an Oklahoma diner, reading a magazine article about D-Day heroes that mentions his bridge demolition in 2 sentences. The writer calls it a precision operation that stopped German armor cold, reducing that Norman night to a footnote in someone else's story about American airborne operations. The article includes a photograph of the destroyed bridge taken days after the battle, when engineers had already begun clearing debris for reconstruction. The young waitress who refills his coffee notices the magazine and the faded paratrooper insignia on his jacket. "My grandfather was in the war," she says quietly. "He never talked much about it, but he kept his uniform in the closet until the day he died. Said some stories were too heavy to share with people who weren't there." McNiece nods, understanding exactly what her grandfather meant. The weight of carrying other men's deaths, the knowledge that survival often depends on factors beyond courage or skill, the way memory preserves details that official histories overlook, these burdens don't translate into casual conversation with people who learned about war from movies and books, rather than from Norman creeks that ran red for days after bridges fell. He thinks about Hayes, who died in a factory accident in 1963, and Kowalski, who never quite figured out how to sleep through the night after the war ended. Brennan made it home to Wisconsin, but spent 30 years jumping at the sound of thunder, reliving that first combat drop into occupied territory. The survivors of that Norman night scattered across America, carrying pieces of the story that only fit together when they gathered at reunions that became smaller each year. The official history preserves the mission's outline, but misses its emotional content, the way fear and exhaustion shaped every decision made in darkness beside a stone bridge that should have fallen sooner than it did. Future generations will read about American airborne operations in Normandy and imagine clean executions of well-planned missions, not the desperate improvisation that actually characterized most combat operations during the invasion. But the memories remain precise in ways that surprise McNiece even now. He can still feel the texture of waterlogged detonation cord, still hear the grinding sound that Roman stonework made as it finally surrendered to forces it was never designed to resist. Most clearly, he remembers those 30 seconds when the bridge refused to fall, when success balanced on the edge of catastrophic failure and luck proved more decisive than training. The article includes quotes from military historians who analyze the invasion's success in terms of superior planning and equipment, reducing complex human experiences to statistical comparisons between Allied and German capabilities. Missing from their analysis is any acknowledgement that individual actions often succeeded despite flawed plans and inadequate equipment. That victory came from men like McNiece, who improvised solutions when doctrine failed to match ground reality. When the waitress returns with his check, McNiece closes the magazine and leaves it on the table for the next customer. The story it tells is true as far as it goes, But truth has layers that don't fit into magazine articles or history textbooks. The deepest layer belongs to the men who were there, who carried Norman mud on their boots and the weight of split-second decisions that affected battles they never saw and men they never met. Outside the diner, a freight train rumbles across a steel bridge that spans the Arkansas River, and for a moment McNiece is 24 years old again, crouched beside a stone pier in occupied France, while German voices echo through the pre-dawn darkness. The sound fades as the train disappears around a curve, leaving only the Oklahoma wind and the knowledge that some stories are too complex for simple telling. The bridge that fell in Normandy bought 24 hours for the Utah beach consolidation, time that contributed to the invasion's ultimate success in ways that can't be precisely calculated. But for McNiece, the true measure of that night isn't found in strategic assessments or casualty reports. It lies instead in the memory of men who trusted his judgment in darkness, who followed him toward a bridge that might not fall and might leave them all trapped in enemy territory with nowhere to run. That trust, more than the medals or citations that followed, represents the real weight of leadership in war, the knowledge that other men's lives depend on decisions made with incomplete information under impossible conditions. It's a burden that doesn't diminish with time, that remains as heavy in an Oklahoma diner as it was beside a Norman creek, where ancient stone finally surrendered to modern explosives and the calculated risks of desperate men. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.